Right, let's get started. Some obvious reminders of your schoolwork. Let me get loading the Blackboard. Right, yeah, so I made some announcements, just updates on week 13, exam 3, and quiz 12 is due. Quiz and discussion for chapter 12, which is social psychology, is due this week, as well as exam 3. So hopefully you guys get that in. Next week, I guess I'll be posting, I did get my videos up on YouTube. No one really watches it that much, but it's going to be up there. So if you guys wanted to, you could see it later. Yeah, I asked about virtual counseling because usually during the psychological disorders and treatment, we talk about going to the counseling center if you're feeling some of the feelings we're talking about with disorders. I posted that on our announcements, so you could reach out to someone from OCC, and they are offering virtual counseling to students. Some other information, if you need a laptop, we have that, and then I listed my phone number, so if you guys need to text me or something like that, it is my Google phone number, so it's going to go through like my computer and stuff, but it works pretty much like a normal phone number. Other than that, we'll just keep continuing on with our lectures on disorders and treatment. Right, so we last left off talking about specific phobias. So this is when you have an extreme irrational fear of specific objects or situations. So if the fear is rational, then it's not really a phobia. So if you're like super germophobic right now because of the coronavirus situation, it wouldn't fall under phobia per se, because you know the coronavirus is very contagious, it's everywhere, horrible consequences and all that stuff. So it wouldn't be considered irrational. But maybe when we get out of the coronavirus, we can revisit the idea of if you're still like, I don't know, being super careful, sanitizing and everything, walking around with a mask 5 years down the line, is that considered a phobia? And that's a possibility that you can have PTSD from what has happened during this coronavirus crisis. So it could happen. So always marked fear about anxiety about a specific object. So some people are afraid of flying, heights, animals, seeing blood. So if you have a fear of getting your shots, that can vary from whether it is because you are afraid of getting the shots. Mainly it's the fear. Some people they're fine with shots, but they're afraid of blood. So like seeing blood causes them to go faint. So it's just kind of that conditioning. Almost. That's weird. Okay, yeah. So, if you guys watched the video, the lady that had the fear of pickles reacted really strongly to pickles, to cucumbers. She does identify some of the stuff like it happening in her childhood. And the interesting thing about phobias is it doesn't actually have to be that thing or object or whatever it is that scared you for that to be the thing you're afraid of. What I mean is I had a student who was afraid of spiders. But it wasn't spiders that scared her, it was her mom. Her mom used to scare her by taking the hair in the drain out and like scaring her with the hair in the drain, which is nasty and all that. But it traumatized her, and basically she translated that fear of the hair drain to spiders, because spiders are little dark wiggly things. So you can see how the original object that scared you doesn't have to be the thing that you're afraid of in the future. So she's afraid of pickles. We don't know if it was a pickle that caused it. It could have been something else, and it just her mind just attached to pickles, and that's what she's afraid of. I've had people afraid of ketchup, mustard, things like that. And it's a phobia because Not everyone runs away in fear of pickles. Other people will lash back out. So I've had a student like attack her friend when she was a kid because they knew she had a fear of mustard, and they like put mustard on her food, and then she attacked them. So stuff like that. One of the characteristics is it always causes clinically significant distress. So to what extent does this phobia really bother you? It's a phobia when it can cause you to lose your job. Like in the video clip, she is willing to lose her job as a waitress over like getting pickles. So she refused to get pickles even if her boss was like, I'm gonna fire you if you don't get that pickle. That really signifies that it is a phobia. Right, so social anxiety phobia. Social anxiety is pretty common. Intense fear of being humiliated or embarrassed in social situations. This usually arises in early adolescence, so usually like middle high school. But some kids will exhibit social anxiety or phobia really early on. So just really not wanting to be in a social situation, like extreme mutism in kids. So just not talking to people, not talking to strangers, only selectively talking to some people. That could be a sign of social phobia as well. So usually there are at least one student a semester in my classes, sometimes more. So I would say a handful of students would suffer from social anxiety phobia. And when I first started teaching, I was like, oh, this sounds like this disorder that would make it kind of hard to really participate in classes, right? Because classrooms are a social situation. But what I found out is these students do go to class and they look pretty regularly. It's just, and they could be even some of the more vocal students I've had in class. So I've had students who tell me they have social anxiety, and then they're the ones who are always like volunteering and stuff. So it's just a matter of like who you're comfortable with. So it's like if you have social anxiety, you probably don't want to talk to a stranger, but you'll be fine around your friends and family because you know them. So it's that fear of talking to a stranger, and it's kind of weird, but you're like, why would I care what a stranger thinks about me? But it's that fear, the anxiety that drives people to have social anxiety. So if you're lost and you have social anxiety, you'd rather be lost than to really ask a stranger for directions. It's that intensive of fear. And to some extent, some of us have it with different conditions. Some students have social anxiety with ordering over the phone. So if you're the student who like, when you try to order something over the phone, you got to write everything out on a script, and you know what you're going to say, what you're going to order. Those are signs that you might have social anxiety. Yeah, so that's why we kind of have online orders. So those kind of work a lot better. You don't have to talk to anybody. You just place your order and pick it up, right? But I've had students who agree with me when they say like if the person on the phone asks them something they're not prepared to answer, they can panic and just hang up the phone. It's like, hey, do you want toppings on that or something like that? And they're like, yeah, and then they'll just hang up and call back again, and be like, okay, this is my answer, or they'll just call a different place in order. So if you find yourself stumbling or stuttering over the phone, you just might just avoid that situation and not call that place back again, or have someone else call and talk over the phone for you. I'm not a big fan of over the phone conversations, so I have a little bit of that. I just prefer talking to people in person, or like using those online chat systems. So that's nice. Right, obsessive compulsive disorder, also known as OCD. This one's pretty common. A lot of people talk about these obsessions and compulsions. We see it a lot on TV a lot because people just it's an easier one to display on TV. Just the idea is that you have these obsessions, which are irrational, anxiety-provoking thoughts. So they're irrational because they're like something bad is going to happen to me or my friends or my family if I don't do something. And that's where the compulsions come in, the behaviors. So these compulsive behaviors, compulsive because you have to do them, so that you reduce the anxiety. So it's always those two together. You have these thoughts that people don't really know about. Remember, the mind is a black box, so we don't know what's going on in our people's minds. Maybe we can see their behaviors, so those compulsive behaviors come out, and that's when we notice it. So let's talk about some of these compulsive behaviors. So OCD is pretty low. Some of us may have OCD tendencies, and we'll talk about OCPD later. That's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Rather than having the full-blown OCD, you can just have traits of OCD. So if you're like really tidy or neat, or you have to do things a certain way, it depends how bad that compulsion is. Like I've had some people re-clean things. It's like someone else cleans it for them and they're like, it's not done right, so they have to re-clean it the way that they need it to be. So you can see there's 28% of adults who experience obsessive compulsions at some point in their lives, but only 2% would develop actual OCD, so that anxiety continues. So OCD onset, I've seen YouTube videos of little kids having OCD and all that. I don't know if I really believe that OCD-ness to be that strong. So I don't know, there's always media and there's always that portrayal. Usually it comes with some type of event. This is somewhat of like an anxiety issue, so it could be your biological systems just getting worked up really well, and you developing some behavior that calms down that system, and so you get that compulsive behavior. But a lot of times it comes with environmental factors, some type of onset, some type of stress or trauma that causes the OCD to be a coping mechanism that kind of rolls out of control. So a lot of times it could be like really small behaviors when it starts, and it could be really beneficial behaviors, like cleanliness, right? So when you first start to develop OCD, you might be like, oh, it's cool, now I like my room clean in a certain way, right? That's cool. But then it starts to kind of escalate, and things, you have to do so many compulsive behaviors, it just goes out of control, and that's when people come and seek therapy for it. So let's talk about some OCD behaviors. The video is a really good demonstration of someone who has like OCD and it's kind of getting out of control because she has different behaviors. So the first one is checking. So this is when individuals, 80% of those who have OCD have checking behaviors. So they have to compulsively check things multiple times. So this is like checking if the stove is on and off. They'll check it like multiple times to notice that it's off. And they're like, it's off. But then their brain says, hey, did you really turn it off? And they'll check again. So checking the doors, checking the locks. Sometimes people like turn the locks multiple times. That's until it feels just right. So there's a number that their mind comes up with. So once they hit that number, it feels right and they stop. So it could be like a 7 or a 9. So they have to check things multiple times till they get to that number, and their brain says it feels right, and then they stop. I've had students talk about checking with at the door, for example, locking up. I had a student who had the lockup shift, or the last shift, and you're supposed to lock up the store. And she has OCD, so she would sometimes walk all the way back to her car, and then, you know, start thinking, did I lock the gates, or did I lock the door, or whatever? And then she'll have to walk back to the store. So that's like 15 minutes walking to her car and back, and then checking it, and then walking back to her car, and then getting that obsession again, and be like, oh, did I really lock it this time? And getting that compulsive behavior and having to go back to the store again and locking it. And you can see this, it takes up a lot of times if you're walking back and forth multiple times to check if you've locked up for the night. So of course that could mean like an hour or two before she even actually leaves work because of the OCD. And you can see how this is clinically significant distress, right? So one solution that she had was that she would text her friend to say that I've locked up to her friend. So when she goes back to her car and she has that those obsessive thoughts come up and say, hey, maybe you didn't lock the door, she'll check her phone and says, you know, I sent a text message to my friend, you know, 15 minutes ago that says I locked up. But sometimes she'll still like not trust herself, and maybe she's like, oh, maybe I just sent the message without actually locking up, and then she has to go back and check again, and then she'll send another message this time saying I've locked up. So you can see how these thoughts, they're irrational, because they just kind of, it's just easier to deal with the compulsive behavior than to deal with the thoughts. So you could just feel anxious all the time, or you can do this behavior and then you feel calm. So that's an example of checking. Ordering, that's the things have to be in a certain order. I've had students who say that like the shoes by the door need to be ordered in a certain way, and if they aren't or things aren't correct, they have to like get it aligned and everything. So that kind of ordering to what feels right for them. So someone who has OCD can notice when things have been moved in their room. So if you're one of those individuals, if someone touches something in your room, you notice it, you might have OCD tendency. So that ordering, it's just your brain picks it up and you're like, something's not right and I have to put it in this particular order, and this is how I like things. Moral concerns, so that could be like just guilty feelings, I guess. So any types of moral concerns, like you're not doing good or you're not being a good person. Some of it's religious. I've had students mention they have to say a prayer a certain amount of times before they can start driving, because their thoughts, their obsessions would be that if they don't do this, they're gonna crash on the way. So they have to say these prayers and then they can start driving. I've had a student basically have to call her mom every day and tell her mom what she did, like everything she did that day, or she'll feel really anxious. So that could be like a moral confession thing. Contamination is the one we kind of think of a lot, the whole hand washing. So contamination, people who usually show up for this is because they hand wash too much, so that their hands are starting to get like red and it's breaking and stuff. Their skin is breaking from all the hand washing. So that's one of the things. So contamination, being afraid of being contaminated. Usually it's germs. All right. Yeah, that's kind of, I sometimes talk about this. Yeah, that's all the videos. So these videos are really kind of good for you guys to watch and get like a better sense of these different disorders. All right. Our next disorder is PTSD. This is post-traumatic stress disorder. Develops due exposure to a traumatic event. And the person who has PTSD can have flashbacks, so they're just revisiting their traumatic events. They tend to be less emotional because emotional experiences can trigger the flashback, so they try not to involve themselves in anything that is too emotional. So that reduces their ability to process emotions as well, so they seem very distant kind of. And there could be excessive arousal to whatever stimulus. So jump scares can really trigger someone who has PTSD to react in a very exaggerated way. So if you're trying to scare your friend and you jump out from behind the corner and they punch you and get really mad at you, that might be a sign of like having PTSD, like they don't want to be scared. Difficulties with memory and concentration. So if you're experiencing a traumatic events, there could be lingering effects where it's hard for you to focus on what's in front of you, so hence the memory and concentration, as well as impulsive behavior. So that can lead to like just more bad behaviors because you just are impulsive. You're just doing anything to basically get your mind off of this traumatizing event. So that includes the use of like drugs and other self-medication. PTSD can follow the trauma immediately or be delayed. So it could be because immediately, like you have the traumatic event and then you develop PTSD the next day, or it could be delayed. So combat, for example, a lot of military personnel, when they're in combat, they just their minds are shift into survival mode and all that, and it kind of buffers it from having PTSD. So when they do the diagnostic on the field after a traumatic event, the person doesn't show signs of PTSD. And it's usually after they go back, after they leave the military, after they resume normal civilian life, that the PTSD shows back up, because now things are back to normal, but they're not really all those. Your brain has time to process the experiences that you had from your time in service, and then that's when those experiences can start to really affect you mentally, and PTSD shows up later. So I think the military is aware of this, and they do diagnostics multiple times. So it's like in the field, and then like when you leave combat, they're supposed to diagnose you and do a follow-up and all that. So sometimes the PTSD shows up much later. For sexual abuse and assault, so violence, Those things can lead you to have a fragmented memory. So it's kind of hard to remember a traumatic event if you're a victim of it. If you guys were following politics a while back, there was a big deal between Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh, our new justice. And the whole main thing they were trying to, I think she was a psychologist, sociologist, but she was like a professor. The main thing they were trying to basically question her on was her memory, right? Because they were saying like, hey, how come you can remember this assault that happened so long ago? Then they questioned how clearly she could remember it, and she could remember it very clearly. Then they questioned other details, right? So it's like, where was it? You know, what house were you? How did you get home and all that? And she really struggled with those because memory can be fragmented if you're a victim of assault. So you could remember the assault really well because it's a PTSD event, but the things following that can be more fragmented, like where the house was, kind of thing. That's normal. So you don't expect someone who's been assaulted to basically have perfect memory. They may have good memory of the person who assaulted them, the situation around that, and then like kind of dissociate the rest of those events and not remember how they got home or how they ended up in the police station, hospital, so forth. Natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, unnatural disasters, California fires, 9/11, all those can lead to a lot of PTSD. So if you were there in New York City when 9/11 happened, that could be a very traumatizing event, just the way people react to it and all that. Can some of us have PTSD developing from this coronavirus crisis? And that's, yeah, it's possible for individuals to develop symptoms of PTSD from how you react to it. If your parents react to it a certain way, people around you react to it to a certain way, that can cause it to be a very scary event. So trying to behave as things are normal, not hoarding and all that, not super sanitizing everything. If all of a sudden at this time your parents flipped over and all of a sudden they're wearing like suits and stuff like that, that could be pretty scary if they start sanitizing everything and locking down and buying guns and hoarding a bunch of supplies and looking at the neighbor with suspicions. That can be very traumatizing for a child to be like, well, what's going on? Why are my parents acting this way? And that can develop PTSD in a child. And there's probably some anxiety issues with the parents if they are going into like full I don't know, zombie outbreak mode. So prevalence for PTSD, we have about 12% of US veterans, so 1 in 10, that's a little bit more than 1 in 10, so pretty high. But about 7% of Americans are estimated to suffer from PTSD, more women than men. So what that is telling us is that about 1 in 10% of the population overall suffers from PTSD. And PTSD can come in all kinds of forms. I've had students have PTSD from car accidents. So if you were in a really bad car accident, you may avoid things in the future that relate to that memory of that car accident. That includes avoiding the road that you were having the accident on. I had a student, she has generalized anxiety, undiagnosed, but she also developed PTSD from being in an accident when she was going in one of those roundabouts. So when she was going in a circle, she got hit from the side, and now every time she goes through one of those roundabouts, she has a lot of anxiety about it. I've had students avoid the freeway because they got in an accident on the freeway, so now they just don't get on the freeway anymore. So things like that. You can have PTSD from school. You know, if there's a really bad incident that happened at school, being assaulted at school, kind of thing like that. Bullying can cause PTSD. A really bad exam could cause a lot of fear with taking future exams. So pretty much anything can trigger you to have PTSD. And remember the diathesis stress model we talked about earlier this week. So basically, the same event may not cause PTSD in one individual, but may cause it in another individual. So it really varies. Some more stuff on PTSD. Marked alterations in arousal and reactivity. So maybe if you see personality changes in a friend or family member after some time, you know, just something happens and this is marked change in the way they react, the way they're acting and stuff, so they might have experienced something traumatic. So, and that could, some signs of that could be irritable behavior, or angry outbursts, usually with little or no provocation. So just getting really upset at you. That could be a sign that they've just experiencing something traumatic and they're dealing with the PTSD from it. Recklessness or self-destructive behavior. So instead of like, well, it probably comes with the irritable behavior and angry outbursts along with it. But the recklessness or like doing drugs, stealing. Some people who've had a traumatic experience might start to do more criminal behaviors, just like a devil-may-care attitude, and just go wild. So that self-destruction, that spiraling out of control could be signs of PTSD as well. Hypervigilance, being super paranoid in a word about your environment. Exaggerated startle response, I mentioned that earlier. Problems with concentration, so just being out of it a lot, not being able to sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, having nightmares, screaming from that. All those are kind of signs that someone is possibly had a recent traumatic events. All right. Right, so we have hoarding disorder. So watch the video clip on hoarding disorder. That kind of explains all of it. It basically just, Hoarders, the TV show, will be a good sign of what hoarding disorder is. This is basically just storing all kinds of things and not being able to get rid of them. And the depression has a lot to do with hoarding disorder. So if your parents, your grandparents, or whatever grew up during the depression, they may have tendencies for hoarding disorder because uncertainty leads people to hoard, right? So they keep things and they're afraid of throwing things away. So my dad went through the Vietnam War. So he has a tendency to pick up trash. Like people throw things out, he used to pick them up because, back after the aftermath of the war was like there was not much things around. So you had to basically salvage and scavenge things together to have things. So now even in America, he still does that now. So my dad would like drive around the neighborhood sometimes and see like furniture, and he would pick up the furniture, but he only picks up like the real wood ones. So the compressed wood, I don't know what it's called, but the wood that has all the stuff, the particle board woods that are pushed together with a bunch of wood, he doesn't take those because those are crap according to him. So he's like, which is right because they are crap, they break apart and all that stuff. He gets the old heavy wood and furniture, like solid wood furniture, and he's like, these are better and stuff. So he still scavenges things around. So we have like bits and pieces of things everywhere, like that he picks up, windows, shutters, things like that, and he's just like, oh, I'm gonna use them later. Sometimes he does, a lot of times he just doesn't. So I do still have tendencies for that too, because growing up in the same family, so I would kind of keep things. I'm like, oh, I'll use it for later, so I still kind of scrap things together, repurpose them and all that. So but my students have told me about hoarding disorders, people growing up in a hoarding household, and it's pretty much true. Like you have a house full of things, it's just rooms full of things. I've had a student mention her dad would say he would buy things for like home improvement and actually never do the project. So it's like he'll buy all the doors for the house and like, oh, we gotta update the doors in our house, and then actually never get around to actually changing out the doors or doing the projects. He accumulates, so everything just kind of accumulates for the future. And yeah, hoarding can take a long time because houses are big, so you can hoard things for a while before you actually run out of room, and then it becomes a major problem. Body dysmorphic disorder. This one's, watch the video on this. This one's pretty common, I guess, in a sense. It's just exaggerated preoccupation with exaggerated or imagined physical defects. So this is kind of like when you really focus on features of yourself, and they might not really be bad features, but to you they are, and you become obsessed with people noticing these bad features. So you have this belief that you just look horrible as a person. So it kind of has like really low self-esteem along with it, and you just feel like nobody wants you, or there's this weird things. I have a big ear, big nose, big eye, and you're just kind of really preoccupied with that. How can anybody love me? I have eyes like an owl or something like that, or ears like an, what's a goblin? I don't know. So that kind of it's a thing that we continue to deal with in today's society, because beauty and the image of beauty is exaggerated in our magazines and models and things like that. So people start to have this feeling that um, they don't fit the mold, but to an extreme extent. So just that hyper focus on how your body looks. Um, there's some forms of body dysmorphia too. So the general form is like feeling really ugly about yourself, having really low self-esteem, feeling no one desires you. Um, but there's been like MPT syndrome is a offshoot of body dysmorphia. So some people who feel like they need to be amputated. There's like a famous, not famous, but a popular documentary about this guy. He wanted to be an amputee to the point that he kept asking doctors to like cut off his leg and they wouldn't do it. So it got to the point that it was so extreme that he submerged his leg in ice until he got frostbite. So it was like 6 hours or something. So for you to have that mental will, focus, and motivation to submerge your body in ice to the point that it freezes. I mean, his body is probably telling him like, "Hey, it hurts." You know, you ever put your hand in ice or hold on to an ice cube and you're like, "Hey, this hurts. I better let go of this ice." You know, to be that long, 6 hours until your leg just freezes itself to death. He did eventually get the amputee because his leg was frostbitten, so they had to cut it off. And he's much happier because he's like, I always wanted to be an amputee. But as the documentary goes on, they ask him like, why do you want to be an amputee? And he's like, I always feel that way. I just feel like the leg doesn't belong to me. But once they start to talk to him about it, you can see that there's this trace back to his childhood. You know, Freud was right about childhood events and stuff. So in the documentary, the guy basically expresses that he was really he didn't, I think he lost, either he lost his father or something. He just didn't have a father figure. His neighbor, who was a veteran, who was an amputated veteran, was like his father figure, and he had a really close connection with his neighbor. And there you go, you know, the light bulb goes off. What he wanted to do by amputating his leg was to identify with that neighbor he had when he was a child, you know, to be, in the sense, similar, closer, whatever the reason. But that's kind of the psychoanalysis of why he wanted to really amputate his leg. Not that his leg wasn't his, but he wanted to identify with the identity of being an amputee. Right. Some origins for these different disorders. We have the biopsychosocial view, right? So psychological views, phobias can be conditioned, feared. So it's just fears that you might have been conditioned to, classic conditioned to, or observant learning. So sometimes you learn fears from your parents. So your parents may have a fear of spiders that can be passed on to you because you're watching them, you're observing them, or their fear can scare you. So, you know, if they react in a strong way, that could scare you. Sorry. Biological fears, besides watching them react in a certain way to fears, they pass on that genetic to you. So if they have high anxiety, which led them to have the fear, the phobia, the anxiety issue, there's a good chance those biological traits get passed down to you, and you have this greater vulnerability to them, and therefore you also develop these anxiety disorders. So if you have anxiety, there's a good chance your parents have anxiety as well. Biopsychosocial view, combination of all that, the biology, the psychological factors, as well as the social factors. It's just how our society views certain things. So culture can influence what you're afraid of, what's appropriate to be afraid of as well, and so forth. So social anxiety, right? That could be a big cultural thing because we used to grow up in smaller villages. You know, if we go back to the evolutionary perspective, humans were hunter-gatherers, our communities were smaller, everyone knew each other. But now we grow up in a society where no one knows each other, right? We're supposed to be afraid of strangers, our neighbors, be suspicious of them and all that. So that can lead to this social anxiety because you don't know who you can trust, right? And also with our social media, right? So now the world's becoming this bigger place. So that can be harder to deal with as well. The preparedness theory of phobia says there are certain things we are more likely to be afraid of than other things. So things such as Animals, dogs, cats, rats, snakes, spiders. Natural environments, heights is a common one. Darkness, water, so fear of deep water. Deep water is pretty scary. It's kind of odd, like you can't see the ground. It's kind of scary. Thunderstorms and so forth. Some people are afraid of situations. Driving over bridges. I have people like will try to avoid driving over bridges whenever they can. If they have to drive over bridges, it's done with a lot of anxiety. So they're just like having on a high streak anxiety, like you're about to speak in front of the whole school or something like that, the whole time while you're driving through this bridge. Some people have the fear of the bridge from Final Destination. I don't know if you guys still watch that, but Final Destination. There's a scene where like the log comes out of the car or something like that, and like hits the car, just a log smashing into the person's car and killing them. So I have students mention they are afraid of driving there behind trucks that are carrying logs. So movies can cause you to have these different phobias as well. So you might have a fear of sewer drains, for example, because you watched, that movie It. I had a friend that was afraid of clowns and sewer drains, the pothole sewer holes, because it would hide under there. I didn't grow up watching it, so didn't have those fears. But he was like, man, I don't like being around those things because clowns. Yeah. So tunnels, enclosed places, fear of elevators, fear of blood, injections and injury, fear of choking or vomiting. So choking is a pretty scary thing. I think I don't really have, um, I don't like fish with bones in them as much because my parents as a kid would always warn me to like, be careful of the bones. It might get stuck in your throat. And as a kid, you're imagining that fish bones stuck in your throat. That's a scary thing. So I just didn't want to eat the fish. So now I still have this not really a desire to eat bony fish. So salmon is cool because they remove the bones and stuff and all that. But if it's really bony fish, I'm just like, yeah, no, I don't want to eat it. Yeah, I also like catfish because catfish is pretty soft and not that many bones. So whatever fish has big bones, I can avoid them. That's cool for me. But if it's tiny fish with lots of bones, I'm just like, I don't want to choke kind of thing. If you guys watch Young Sheldon, the TV series, there's an episode where he starts having a fear of choking. So his mom makes all his food into smoothies so that he wouldn't choke on them. So she was blending his food so that he would drink it instead, so he didn't have to be afraid of choking. But he eventually gets over his fear. Fear of loud noises, that's a pretty natural fear. Gunshots, thunderstorms. Fear of costume characters, that could be grown up. Or you can ask questions, are clowns inherently scary? I think they are weird in a sense, but I don't think they're like inherently scary. But costume characters, there's a lot of, maybe they are. Maybe it's just weird that this big white face person with a red nose comes at you and acting all loud, right, with the horn and stuff, and that can cause you to be traumatized as a kid. So I don't know if I would rent a clown for a kid's party. Seems kind of, I don't know, they could be scary, right? And a lot of movies use them, and that can cause you to have a fear if you watch a movie with someone with a costume character. All right, so how should we treat anxiety disorders? You can treat anxiety disorders through psychotherapy. So a lot of psychodynamic approaches. Remember, that's the Freudian approach. They would try to figure out what the underlying cause of the anxiety is. What did it start? When did you start being afraid? When did you start having these anxiety feelings? What caused it? So, and then trying to address any defense mechanisms as possible. Because a lot of times we build up barriers, we build up excuses around why we're afraid of certain things. We think being afraid of spiders is silly, so we come up with some other excuse, all kinds of things, right? So defense mechanisms, we talked about those. Any repression, so it's possible that traumatic events, you can repress the memory. So maybe you don't have memory of something happening. So are there periods of time in your life that you don't have that much memories about? Did you really forget, or were the memories repressed? Cognitive behavioral therapy, we try to address the cognitions and behaviors associated with the anxiety provoking stimulus. So this is a lot of, hey, what can you be aware of what's going on in your mind? when you start having these anxiety situations? Can you figure out what the triggers are, and what kind of behaviors can you do to address that? So the big thing about classic conditioning, right? The more you have your body experience something, the more that becomes a almost instinctual response. So what I'm talking about is like something that scares you and you let your body react to that fear, right? Then the next time it scares you, your body's going to go straight to that fear response. So cognitive behavior therapy says, hey, let's be aware of what scares us and how can we react to it, right? So instead of seeing that spider and like freaking out and screaming out the house, be like, oh, okay, I think that's a spider. I'm going to calmly walk out of here and tell someone else that, hey, go take care of that spider for me. So that would be, as you continue to do that, then the fear of the spider doesn't get activated as much, and actually that instead of being afraid of spiders, your response to spiders is, hey, I better go get someone else to deal with that spider, and then you lessen that fear over time. The humanistic response tries to reassure the client and provide support that their anxieties, their fears are rational, at the same time building up their self-esteem to address and face their anxieties. So like, building up your self-confidence, helping you to realize that you're bigger than the fear itself. So a lot of these disorders, these anxiety disorders, is that irrational exaggeration of the fear. So telling yourself that you can deal with it, that can help to improve your own capacity to deal with it. Systematic desensitization, gradually exposing yourself to the fear. So if you have fear of spiders, you can see pictures of spiders. I've had students who cannot deal with a picture of a spider or whatever they're afraid of, a snake. So they would have people go through the book, any book they have, and like tape up, block out any pictures of like whatever they're afraid of, snakes, for example, in the book, so that they don't see it and get triggered, right? So gradual exposure is you start from like pictures and then videos and then seeing them in person behind a cage or something like that, and then like letting the animal out, and then basically touching the animal. If it's a fear of snake, you'll let the snake out and then you'll have the snake around your neck or whatever. And if you can deal with that, you'll get over your fear of snakes. Yeah. And it could go wrong, and the fear could be even exaggerated more. So the gradual desensitization is really important. So virtual therapy, this can be used just to do the same thing, right? But you can just take it off at any time. So virtual therapy is getting better and better. Our virtual realities are getting better. So social anxiety, you can go into a virtual chat room now and talk to strangers. So that can kind of help you deal with your social anxiety, being able to talk to strangers. Reliving traumatic events through PTSD can help you to process and deal with them. Dealing with your virtual fear of animals, shots, and all that, you can all do that through virtual stimulation. Because anytime you get too panicky, you can just take off the virtual stimulation and you're back safe and sound. Modeling behaviors, social skills training can help, showing people tips and tricks on how to deal with anxiety provoking situations, especially with social anxiety, like how to have a small conversations or busy conversations. They're called small talk. Yeah, small talk with strangers and so forth. All right. Okay, I'm just gonna end it there, and we'll come back and talk more about cognitive therapy and finish it up and get into our next disorder. Yeah, so we still have a lot of time, and like I usually don't stream as long. And, oh, hey, Atten. One person joined, but I usually don't stream as long if no one's there. So I'll see you guys next Monday, and I'll upload those links to the YouTube videos if anybody wants to watch a past broadcast that they missed. All right, stay safe and healthy. See you guys next time.